God will get a hold of you. Let me say that again. God will get a hold of you. And the reality of that statement is guaranteed to elicit one of two responses: incredible comfort or intense concern. Because God getting a hold of us is serious business that we need to consider. And yet, some people, maybe even some of us here today, wonder whether that's true. Can God really do that? Is he capable? Is he able to get a hold of anyone? Because, hey, I know some people, right? I know some people. And they're the kind of people that I wonder whether God would even want to get a hold of, even if he could. And if he could, it still seems like a pretty long reach. I mean, how long is his arm anyways? When we hear that truth, we instantly see people in our minds. And we can question whether or not God really can get a hold of them. And it's easy for us to do that. It's easy for us to point to somebody else. But that's not what I said. I said God will get a hold of you. God will get a hold of you. And I wonder how many people maybe are pointing the finger at you today, wondering whether God can really do that. Or wondering whether that has actually happened. I mean, because what does that look like anyways? When God gets a hold of someone, what does that look like? How does he work? Well, we're going to look at a story, 2 Kings chapter 5. We've been in the book of 1 and 2 Kings for a while, in this series called The Living Edge. And today we're looking at, for what some of us will be a familiar story in 2 Kings chapter 5, the story of a man named Naaman. And let's begin to work through this text. And I really invite you to follow along if you would want to do that. In 2 Kings chapter 5, this is how we are introduced to Naaman. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier. When we first meet Naaman, he is a fiercely independent soldier who is far from God. I mean, he thinks he's something pretty special. And in fact, a lot of people would agree with that. Because in a sense, he's kind of like a modern-day superhero. He's like the stuff of legends. He rules men. I mean, he's called a commander. He is regarded by greatness, revered by greatness. Even his own king, a great man, highly regarded him. And he's head and shoulders above the average guy. He is a valiant soldier. That means that he's worth something. He is a fiercely independent man, a superhero to his nation, and he's far from God. And yet God gets a hold of him. God even gets a hold of a guy like this. And through his story, we really learn how God works and what that looks like. First of all, when God's work begins early. In verse 1 it says, through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. You know, Naaman didn't even acknowledge that God was in his life, and yet God was already working behind the scenes of his life. No one saw this. No one would acknowledge this. And yet we see in verse 1, even before Naaman sees this, is that God's hand is already on Naaman. Because God's work begins early. And God's work is necessary. See, I didn't read the last 4 words of verse 1. It says, but he had leprosy. Naaman's falling apart. Literally. Naaman is falling apart. He has this horrific disease called leprosy. And leprosy basically leaves deposits on nerve endings, which eventually eliminates your ability to feel and can actually cause the loss of limbs. For a soldier to have this is a death sentence. This is a death sentence for him, for anybody. And yet he's a soldier. And he's hiding this behind his armor. Because isn't that what big men do? They hide behind their armor. And this is what Naaman is doing. Not many people would have known this at this point, because if they did, they would run from him. He's hiding it behind his armor. So God's work is necessary. But it's necessary for a lot deeper reasons than his flesh. Look at verse 2. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. Naaman had become a superhero to his people by killing. And many of those killings would have been from the innocents. He had become a superhero from killing the innocent and from kidnapping even young girls. I mean, this guy's a pretty bad dude. He's famous because he kills and kidnaps. This is a pretty bad dude. I mean, he has a past. And his past drags with it a long rap sheet of all the things that he's done wrong. And his past isn't going anywhere. I mean, it's catching up to him. And it's picking up pace because it in no way is going to slow down unless he's able to deal with it and leave it behind. And that's the first thing we can see in someone's life that God gets a hold of. When God gets a hold of a life, we can let go of our past. When God gets a hold of a life, we can let go of that past. This year I met a new friend of mine. His name's Mike. And Mike is a former gang member who, in the years of wearing his gang patches, had a pretty long rap sheet himself of killings and kidnappings. At one point in his life, he told me that he was on trial for 60 charges, most of those from holding people hostage. He's a pretty bad dude. And literally, his life was falling apart. But God got a hold of him. God got a hold of him. And he was able to leave the past behind. This is a picture of Michael talking to my wife, Danielle. And she just thought he was a big softy, right? And here he is talking to, I had an event with the Barrie Colts hockey team this year. And Michael was invited to come and speak to them. His story is of one bad dude that God got a hold of. And he was able to leave his past behind. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. That's steps. It takes steps to be able to do that. And yet, when God gets a hold of your life, you can let go of that. When God gets a hold of a life, the past is let go of. Now look at verse 3, because I'm going to the next phase of the story. This slave girl in verse 3 says this. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Now, that alone is an amazing thing. I mean, here's this young girl who's been captured, taken from her home, held as a slave, who was showing an incredible kindness to her captor. She points him in God's direction. And we can never underestimate the power of a simple task. And God's work is simple. God's work is simple. And this is what she said. This is how simple it is. God can cure him of leprosy. That's as simple as it is. God can do this. And in verse 10, we actually hear the instructions that are just as simple as this. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." I mean, this is not hard. What he's being asked to do is not hard at all. It's very simple. And yet, we tend to complicate the simple, don't we? We throw things in there which really complicate it. And that's what happens here too. Look at verse 4 and 5. Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means, go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. All of a sudden, this simple task gets real complicated. And part of why it gets complicated is cultural. Part of the complexity is cultural, because actually Naaman couldn't leave without his king's permission. So he had to go to the king, get permission, and the king was going to really sign a letter, which in a sense is kind of like a visa or a passport, which allowed him access into these other lands without danger to himself. I mean, this is a rough guy. They know who this guy is. There's kind of like a clear path. But this complicates things now. And so part of the complexity is cultural. Part of it is created all by himself. Because all of a sudden he thinks there's more to do here. I mean, there's got to be more here to be done than that. I mean, surely there's more. I mean, I got to bring some stuff. Surely there's going to be payment necessary. I mean, this can't be this simple. In fact, it is simple. God's work is not only simple, but God's work is a spiritual work. The physical stuff doesn't really matter too much. Look at verse 6. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending you my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." Now watch what the king does in verse 7. "As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, 'Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he was trying to pick a quarrel with me.'" When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Notice what the king does here. Okay, what does the king do? He tears his robe. Why does he do that? He does that because he can't see God's hand. The king is unable to see God's hand. All that the king is able to see in this letter is what he thinks is some sort of a scheming trick to try to lure him into another physical war. But this is not just something physical happening here. See, God is concerned with the spiritual, because he doesn't just want to restore his body. Okay, let's get this clear. He doesn't just want to restore this man's flesh. That's not God's number one priority. God wants to do a spiritual work in the life of this man and restore him through relationship with him. Because God's work is spiritual. And the reason for why the king freaks out is because, one, he can't see the spiritual. And because he can't see the spiritual, he knows he can't control it. He's got no control here. And neither does Naaman. This is well beyond their control. And that's the second thing I think we see when God gets a hold of our life. When God gets a hold of us, we let go of the past. We also let go of control. And for some of us, that is the one reason that we have so much grief in our life. There is an article written 2 years ago on Psychology Today. Again, a secular magazine. I understand that. But they're looking at people with anxiety and depression and stress-related issues in their life. And they realized in this massive research they did that all of these people had one common trait. And I'm not trying to simplify this. I know there's a whole lot of layers to all these types of things. But the one thing they said, this is the one thing we see in every single person who's stressed. They try to control things they can't. They try to control things they can't. A good friend of mine, he's a pastor locally here. And he was stressed. We can get a little stressed. I'll admit that. Okay, this can be a little stressful sometimes. And there was a season going through his church, and he was a little bit stressed. And his wife was meeting with a bunch of pastors' wives in his area to have a Bible study. And one of the pastors' wives was actually the wife of Charles Price. You know that name? He used to be the pastor at People's Church. And she went to my friend and just kind of asked what was going on. And she said, Darren, this is what she said to me. She looked at me and she said, stop trying to do Jesus' job for him. You're stressed out because you're trying to do Jesus' job for him. And what she was saying is what we need to hear. Some things are not for us to control. Some things are for God to control. See, when we let go of control, it doesn't mean we let go of irresponsibility, of our responsibility. There are some things that we will now do because God's in control. But there's also some things that we know God alone has to do because he is in control. And when God gets a hold of our life, more and more we're able to let go of that. When God gets a hold of your life, personal control can be let go of. That's easy, isn't it? I mean, this is easy stuff, right? I mean, we don't get any, this is marvelous, right? How awesome this is. I mean, we never get stressed about this kind of stuff. This is easy for us. Well, let's see what Naaman does. Maybe we'll feel better about our own reactions. In verse 11, this is what happens. But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord as God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. Guilty as charged. See, God's work is also something else. God's work can be frustrating. Felt those frustrations? God's work can be frustrating. And just like Naaman, it can be frustrating when our expectations aren't met. That's why the frustration comes. Because our expectations aren't met. Look at what Naaman says. He starts off by saying, I thought. See, he had different plans. He had different expectations. I mean, Naaman thought that there'd at least be some sort of a show where he'd come out and, one, actually talk to him. That's the first thing. But two, I mean, do something really amazing and put on some show here. He thought, and his expectations aren't met. It can be frustrating when, just like Naaman, our ego gets bruised. He thinks he deserves better than the mighty river of Jordan. I mean, he's Naaman. He's a superhero. The stuff of legends. He deserves better than that. In fact, he thinks he deserves the waters of Damascus. I mean, at least those waters are crystal clean and clear. His ego gets bruised. And it can be frustrating when, just like Naaman, our emotions get rattled. He's angry now. And he goes off in a rage. You know, here's the thing with emotions. I know I've said this before. Emotions are very good at telling us where we are. But they're very, very bad at helping us get to where we need to be. And in this moment, right now in the life of Naaman, okay, his expectations aren't met. His ego's just bruised. His emotions are running off, all rampant. At this moment, he hits this crisis of belief. And we all hit them. He's in this moment, this crisis of belief. We've all had them for these very reasons. And we all get over them the same way. Faith. Now, listen to this very closely, because this is you won't find these details in the text. If Naaman chooses to allow his frustration control him, then this is what he's prepared to do. He's prepared to walk 70 miles further than where God told him to go, to be home, to be where he thinks he wants to be. 70 miles further than where God said, at a place where he thinks he's going to be comfortable. And yet he's going to do that, and he's not going to be healed. He's going to be worse off than before. See, sometimes faith is often it's just the easier path to take. But if he lets his emotions control him, his bruised ego control him, or his unmet expectations control him, he's going to go back home way further than where he is right now to not be any better off. In fact, worse off, because there he's going to die. And this is what Naaman does. In verse 13, Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it?" So they're saying, look it. If the prophet had patted your ego, you would have done something. But he didn't. How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? This is so easy what he's saying here. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. God's work is frustrating, but through faith, it becomes favorable. And Naaman's faith is not seen in one step. Naaman gets over this crisis of belief through a faith that takes many steps. In fact, 32 miles of steps to get to the Jordan River. 32 miles of small steps to get to where he needs to be. And 7 dips. Not 2 dips, not 4, 5, 6, 7 dips. His faith was seen in each and every one of those small steps. How often is it that we miss the favor of God because we walked 31 miles and didn't get the last one? How many times have we missed the favor of God because we dipped 6 times and didn't finish to the end? The most painful part of that question is that you don't know. Naaman could have let his ego run the day. But when God gets a hold of a life, we can let go of our pride. I think that's another way we see God's work in someone. See, when God really has a hold of you, personal pride can be let go of. It becomes about what He wants. In 1 Peter 5:6 it says, "Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and He will lift you up in His time." And for Naaman, that was 32 miles and 7 dips. When God gets a hold of your life, you let go of your past. You let go of control. You let go of your pride. We're not done with the story. There's a little bit left. God's work is also awe-inspiring. Look at verse 18. Look at verse 15. I'm not quite there yet. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." Why did he know that? Because God was doing a deeper work than just his body. "So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. Verse 17, "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." God's work is awe-inspiring. In fact, Naaman is so awe-inspired that he wants to give Elisha a gift, the man that wouldn't even come out and say hi. But he wants to give Elisha a gift. And while that is admirable, it's also not necessary. In fact, Elisha makes it very clear to Naaman that he's taking nothing from him. Why? He didn't do anything. God did everything. And he's ensuring that Naaman's awe is pointed continually in that right direction. He's awe-inspired. And then verse 17 is interesting, though, because after he knows he can't leave anything for Elisha, he says, "And let me take some dirt." What's that all about? That seems kind of weird. Well, there was an understanding in that day that gods lived in lands. So it was the God of Israel, the God of this place, the God of this place. And so Naaman, very early in his faith, he's only been a believer for a few moments here, still believes that God must live here. And so he wants to take some dirt with him. Even more interesting than that is this. Elisha lets him. Naaman didn't have all his theology right. But Elisha didn't try to push that right now. He let Naaman take some dirt. There's a couple reasons for that. The first reason, I believe, is because Elisha knew that he wasn't going to worship the dirt, all right? If he was going to worship the dirt, then there would have been more explanation here, probably even a denial. But Naaman wants to bring this dirt as a symbol, as a reminder. And we know that God piles dirt in the Old Testament as reminders for his people about, over there God did this. And over here God did this. In fact, he commands his people to build those so that you can tell your children about these things. And so Elisha knows that this is just going to be a symbol that reminds Naaman of how amazing God is. And Naaman is going to worship that God, not the dirt. And so God's work is awe-inspiring. And it's also accountable. Verse 18. This is what Naaman says. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." Right away, in Naaman's newfound faith, he knows he's accountable. And so he asks immediately for forgiveness for when he has to be at his master's side, who's going into a temple to worship a false god. When he bows down and he's leaning on his arm and Naaman has to kind of go with him so he doesn't fall, Naaman wants forgiveness for that because he knows it's wrong. He knows that that what his master is doing is not something that he is even going to approve of. He knows he's going to be accountable for these things. And so instantly he makes sure that Elisha knows, this is not my heart's intent anymore. So will you please forgive me when I got to do my job? God's work is awe-inspiring and accountable. Naaman knows this. Naaman knows he's going to be accountable for things. But the last part of this chapter, I'm going to breeze over really quickly, tells the story of Elisha's servant Gehazi, who hasn't quite got this concept yet. He's forgotten that he's going to be held accountable. So here's the paraphrase of this last part of the story in verse 19 to 27. Naaman goes off. He's left nothing there. And then there's Gehazi. And Gehazi, he holds on to the past because he remembers what he just heard. I mean, Naaman's got millions of dollars on his donkeys and some pretty cool clothes. And he takes control of that situation because in his pride, he thinks he deserves a little bit more than nothing. So he chases down Naaman and comes up with this kind of crazy story of, oh, by the way, we just had some guests show up and Elisha needs some stuff for them, so he got a little bit of money, maybe some clothes. And Naaman, of course, he doesn't know he's lying. He says, yeah, sure, and he gives Gehazi all these things to take back. And then Elisha comes to Gehazi and says this, hey, where you been? It's kind of like what God asked Adam in the garden, where have you been? Right? And Gehazi said, well, I haven't gone anywhere. And look what happens to Gehazi. In verse 27, I'll just read you the last verse. Verse 26. But Elisha said to him, was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes or olive groves and vineyards or flocks and herds or male and female servants? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever. Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. We will be accountable. Gehazi was accountable, and we will too. We will be too. And it's interesting that Naaman, new in his faith, was so willing to drop those temporal things. And Gehazi couldn't wait to get his hands on them. Which I think is the last thing we can see in this story anyways, of how we know God gets a hold of a life. When God gets a hold of a life, temporal things are very easily let go of. Those things that aren't just going to last are not much of a concern for us anymore. God will get a hold of you. Does that make you comfortable? Or does that concern you? A couple years ago, I read a book, autobiography, of a man by the name of Chad Williams. And his book was called The Seal of God. Chad Williams grew up wanting to be a Navy SEAL. And his hero was a man by the name of Scott Helvenston. And Scott Helvenston was a bit of a Naaman, actually. I mean, he was a hero. He was a Navy SEAL himself. He had all these records that no one was ever able to beat, like physical exercise records and all these other kind of pinnacles of that vocation. And Chad wanted to be just like Scott. But just a few days before Chad was going to go to Navy SEAL training camp, there was a horrific news story that went on the news. See, his friend Scott was in Iraq with 3 other people on a secret project, mission. And they were overtaken by insurgents, and their car was set on fire. And then those bodies were dragged from the car, and they were beaten. Some of them were tied to cars and driven through the streets. Other ones were hoisted from a rope on a bridge over top of the Euphrates River. One of those guys was Scott. And just a few days before hitting this intense training, he sees his hero's body hung up on a bridge in Iraq over the Euphrates River. Now he really wants to be a Navy SEAL. And he goes through that training. And he passes, which is amazing. 176 guys showed up, 13 passed. And Chad was one of these men. And he became a Navy SEAL. And he began doing what Navy SEALs do. You know, they're the stuff of legends. They're the stuff where we get our movies from these days. I mean, they're really an incredible physical individual with all that they can do. And Chad got to the pinnacle where he was going. And he realized that he was holding on to temporal things. That stuff really mattered to him. He certainly was prideful. That's why he wanted to go fight in the first place. And Navy SEALs, I mean, they take control. And this was a guy that learned to take control. And he recognized that he had a past as well. And he was hanging on to all these things. And he realized, I'm miserable. There was no comfort in his life at all. So here's a man holding on to all these things that he thought mattered. And he's got no comfort. His parents were faithful Christian parents, and they invited him to attend a meeting in the States hosted by a man by the name of Greg Laurie. And you might know that name. He's probably the evangelist now of our day, now that Billy Graham has passed. Greg Laurie. And he went into this massive stadium, and Greg Laurie is speaking about this man named Naaman. Soldier. Stuff of legends, just like he is. And he began to hear the story unfold just like it was unfolded to us today. And he realized something. He realized he was holding on to all these things, and he knew that they were his armor. These things were his armor. You know, armor is important to a soldier. But he realized that just like Naaman, nothing was going to change until he took that armor off. Because Naaman wasn't going to get clean until he walked those 32 miles and took his armor off and stood really naked before God. This is who I am. This is my problems. And then dipped 7 times. And he knew comfort would not come until he let go of his armor. He knew he had to let go of his past. See, and when God gets a hold of you, you're able to let go of your past because you hold on to a God who is gracious to you. See, because God is gracious, no matter what you've done, God says, I can cover that. I can handle that for you. See, Christ's sacrifice on the cross is one that guarantees that. No matter what bad things we've done, those sins can be forgiven because God is gracious. Ephesians 1:7 says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of his grace. See, he had to let go of his past, but he couldn't let go of his past without hanging on to a God who is grace. He had to let go of control. And when God gets a hold of you, you can let go of control because you know you're holding on to a God who is sovereign. He's now in control. And in fact, he tells us in Isaiah 55, verse 9, hey, look at my ways are better than your ways. And my thoughts, they're better than your thoughts. And when God gets a hold of you, you're able to let go of your pride. And you're able to let go of that piece of armor because you hold on to a God who is trustworthy. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 5 says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man." But verse 7 says, "But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord." And he is able, when God gets a hold of you, you're able to let go of those temporal things, those things that don't matter, that aren't going to last, because you hold on to a God who is just. And he will give you exactly what you deserve. Romans 14:12 says, we all must give an account of ourselves to God. And this man, Chad, in that moment, knew that he had no comfort in his life. His armor was up, but he had to drop it. And when God gets a hold of you, you can let go of all those things. Your armor can drop. And comfort comes because we can hold on to him. God will get a hold of you. And that's comforting if you have a hold of him. Let's pray. God, today, we thank you for this old familiar story, and yet we recognize, again, with all these old stories, the truth is not old. Those things that you want us to learn can be brand new. And so, God, today, I thank you for the things that we could just glean from in the life of this man named Naaman. God, I understand that many people came in today with their armor up. I mean, they don't want to know. They don't want to let anyone know that things are falling apart and that there's no comfort. And they stand strong in that. And their defenses are up. And yet there's often no comfort. And so, God, I thank you today, just even for the reminder that maybe some of us need today. That when you get a hold of us, because you are gracious, because you are in control, sovereign, because you are trustworthy, because you are just, we can let go of all those things, knowing that we hang on to a God who is all those things. Do we have comfort? Is that something we can say this morning? Are we hanging on to you? God, so I pray for the Naamans in the room. Those that think they got it all together. Those that think everything is just fine, but in the back of their minds at night, they know they're restless. They know they're concerned with a lot of things. God, I pray for those Naamans. And I pray that in that crisis of belief that maybe they've carried in on their shoulders today, that they'll be able to understand that when they walk by faith, they not only get over the crisis, but they find you and all the favor that you have for them. So I pray for the Naamans in the room, God, that they would drop their armor, humble themselves, and come to you, knowing that when you get a hold of them, the only comfort is found in when we hold back, when we hold on to you ourselves. I pray that concern can be replaced by comfort. And I thank you for how you do that because of who you are. Let me pray these things in your name, God. Amen.